the 1931 Cadillac V16 engine. A full 3 years before this car debuted on December 27, 1929, this engine was in development under top secrecy there at General Motors. Alfred P. Sloan and only the top brass knew what was going on, and matter of fact, all the engineering notes stated bus or truck, so that they kept things under secrecy. What they did is they wanted an engine that was quiet, smooth, and powerful. As the market demanded more and more automobile, the roads were getting better and better. They had to make a decision on what to do. They had these bigger cars, they needed more horsepower. Duesenberg went with straight 8 dual overhead cam to get their horsepower, but Cadillac felt that that really lacked the refinement that their customers were looking for. So they chose to go with a V16, which is one crankshaft shared by 2 8-cylinder engines. But you would think that this thing is massive. It's really not. It's got a 3-inch bore and a 4-inch stroke. And this engine is actually a couple of inches shorter than the Pierce Arrow V12. And it's actually 4 inches shorter than the Packard 8. So it's not this huge engine that people think about, but they claim that it came out with 175 horsepower. I think they're optimistic like most manufacturers were. But they knew their market, and they knew that they needed quiet, smooth power, and this car that weighs almost 6,000 pounds can actually go into third gear at 2.25 miles per hour. I found that after driving this car, it's more like 10 miles an hour, I can pull away in third gear on level ground. What made this so quiet and smooth was these guys were the first to come out with overhead valve hydraulic lifters, and that kept everything whisper quiet. There was a couple of different designs of hydraulic lifters. They adopted one kind, the other kind they eventually adopted into their engines. But virtually everybody adopted the hydraulic valve lifter so that they could quiet these big motors up. The other thing that made this motor a little bit quieter than, say, the Marmon engine, it put out slightly more horsepower and it had a higher top end speed for the car, was that they had cast iron cylinder housings. The Marmon utilized a lot more aluminum in their engines, and so they weren't quite as quiet. Cadillac knew their market. They wanted an engine that would idle really low. This engine idles at 320 RPM. They knew that they needed quiet, lots of power, an elegance, a refinement of their car. The sales success actually surpassed everything that they expected at Cadillac. They debuted this car on December 27th, 1929. They took 3 cars to the New York Auto Show in January 1930. They took in orders starting on December 27th. By 9 months, they had sold over 2,200 vehicles, over $13 million in sales, and way exceeded their expectations. This car cost $5,750, so it was very expensive at the time, and there's a lot of accessories on this particular car, and I'm sure a lot of them were accessorized up, so they were pushing $6,000 by the time they left the showroom. So it was going marvelously. Here we were after the crash in the stock market and the economy heading downhill, and they're selling a ton of cars. To give you an idea, Duesenberg in 1929 sold about 50 cars. So Cadillac was selling a lot of cars, and they sold over 200 of this model. This is a model 4380 all-weather Phaeton in 1931. So tremendously successful. What this is 2 engines sharing a crankshaft and a camshaft. So you've got 2 carburetors on each side identical. They used a Johnson carburetor in 30 and 31. It's okay. When you get them tuned up, they're not bad, but they're a little difficult. You got to put brass floats in them or they will leak a lot of fuel. There's no real air cleaner in it. They just have this air horn here, and so that's kind of a bummer. We'd like to have a better air cleaner in them. This tank here, and there's a mate to it over on the other side, is a vacuum tank, pulls fuel up from the tank, and then gravity feeds down to the carburetors. They did have an oil filter in this, but it didn't filter the entire engine. That's what this chrome canister here is, and inside there is a filter. We modify and put a modern filter on the inside. Mainly what that was for was to make sure that the oil going to the lifters was perfectly clean, because they'll clog really easy if it had any kind of dirt in it. The radiators were bigger for the V16s. The rear end ratio was a little bit different for the V16 versus the V8. The transmission was the same, but the clutch was a little bit bigger. So what they tried to do is use as many of the V8 parts as they possibly could, but the greater horsepower that this engine put out required them to have a little bit more cooling capacity and that kind of thing. So it is super quiet, it is super smooth. You can take off from a real low RPM and a real low speed in them, so that is as advertised. I see a lot of figures on mileage per gallon of these things. I think realistically it's somewhere between 6 and 8 miles to the gallon. I've seen it publicized as 4. That's just not true. I get 6 to 8, depends on what we're doing with it. But my V12s, for instance, my Lincoln V12s are getting 8 to 10, so they do a little bit better. So it's really a refined piece of machinery. It's not a performance car. It's not like the foreign cars were set up. This was for the very wealthy person that's going to the theater or something. They want to accelerate from the rest of the crowd and get out into traffic ahead of all the normal cars. Cadillac knew their market, and this is what they gave them, and it was a tremendous success.